So it's my great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Sanford, a dear friend, longtime collaborator of the Hildebrand Project. In fact, I have the great honor of having him as the chairman of the Hildebrand Project board. So it's been a wonderful collaboration that we have. JJ is the 10th president of the University of Dallas. Before going to the University of Dallas, where he arrived as provost, he was the I never get this right. The Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs, is that? At Franciscan University. And so in that capacity, JJ was the person who allowed or helped to bring the Hildebrand Project here to Franciscan. And so we're immensely grateful, JJ, for all of the important things you've done in the life of the Hildebrand Project. JJ is also a professor of philosophy at the University of Dallas, a published author with work in a variety of areas, especially in virtue ethics. And today he will be addressing us in this opening keynote on the theme of gratitude. So we're just delighted to have you here, JJ. So after your remarks, we'll have questions from the audience, and we'll have a number of portable microphones that will go around the room. So we'll just, do our best to get to you. Just be assertive in raising your hands, and we'll have a vibrant conversation, I'm sure. So JJ, with that, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you, John Henry, for your very warm remarks. It's a true delight to be here at Franciscan University. As you mentioned, I was here for many years, I think 13 in all, and I see in the audience many of my former colleagues. I didn't say hi to you yet, Michael. It's wonderful to see you, and Pat and Dan and former students and then some current students here. University of Dallas is representing strongly at the Hildebrand Project. So thank you for the invitation to address this audience, and thanks to Dr. Crosby for the theme of gratitude. I learned yesterday, we had some meetings, that the original plan was to talk about, I think, the metaphysics of community, and Dr. Crosby had the insight that gratitude is a particularly significant theme at this moment of our culture's struggles, our interior struggles, and I think he's exactly right. So I'm going to talk through my paper. I've got a little too much material to just read it through, plus it's more boring for you, I think, if I just give you a straight reading. And my argument is relatively simple, and what will matter is whether or not the premises to it are, in fact, true. The founding assumption of this conference is that a fundamental disposition of gratitude is essential to a flourishing human life. And I would be surprised if any of you disagree with that. If you do, it would be great to have that come out in our question period. Certainly, it's an assumption that is in need of some refinement, right? What do we mean by a flourishing human life? What is a disposition? And I'm mainly going to be talking a little bit about what a disposition is, as I understand it, in the context of virtue. I think there are at least two ways that we can come at a support of this claim about the significance of gratitude for living a flourishing life. One is to see it as a kind of conditional claim. If you want to be happy in the sense of flourishing, in the sense of eudaimonia, you ought to cultivate a fundamental disposition, a deep-seated virtue of gratitude. And the other, I think, drawing upon our Jewish and Christian inheritance, and particularly the scriptures, gives us a divine command framework to come at the necessity of gratitude for flourishing. I think a command to offer thanks is embedded in the Decalogue, right? And when Joseph Pieper talks about the significance of festivity and the essence of festivity being wrapped up in divine worship, he's drawing upon what it really means to keep holy the Sabbath and to set aside time to express our gratitude to God, to our parents, to those who serve as moral exemplars in some way, and to our benefactors. And in fact, when Aquinas talks about gratitude in question 106 of the second part of the Summa Theologiae, he gives us just that priority of recipients, proper recipients of our gratitude. Okay, God, our parents, those who serve as heroic types to which we can turn and from which we can direct our own actions, and then our benefactors, right? They're last in that list. St. Paul sums up what I consider a theme that runs through both the Old and the New Testament, and saying in 1 Thessalonians, in all circumstances give thanks, for this is the will of God through Jesus Christ for each of you, right? In all circumstances give thanks. This is the will of God, right? This is why I'm framing this in terms of a divine command. It's what God requires of us, right? So whether looking at a natural law framework, which is how I would come at that conditional claim, if you want to be happy, then you need to cultivate gratitude, or whether you're looking at this from a divine command structure, it's one thing to recognize that gratitude is necessary for a flourishing life, and it's another thing to actually cultivate those practices that ensure its deepening within the human heart. So too, it's one thing to acknowledge God's commands. It's another thing to embrace them as proper and good for you. I talk about obstacles in this essay, and I wanted to say something about why I use this term obstacle. Obstacle or a blockade, so to speak, is I think the appropriate term, because there's something natural about gratitude. I'm thinking particularly of children who oftentimes will just be overwhelmed with a sense of gratefulness to their parents, and will express it in really tender ways. And it tends to be the nature of our rough existence that we become jaded over time, right? And so that which seems so natural to children is blocked in time. And so I don't want to suggest that any virtue that's either acquired or infused, and I think that gratitude is Aquinas puts it in the category of justice, but it's intimately related also to charity. It's not as though we just naturally acquire these, right? But there is, I think, a sense in which if those intimations of the human heart, particularly in the young and us even in moments, could, as it were, coalesce into a deep well of gratitude, that would be the natural progression. And I'm also drawing on the teleological framework that you're familiar with from Aristotle, right? It's our end to exercise gratitude. It's intimately connected to our flourishing. So I want to identify two obstacles that you might think of as ideologically formed. They're out there in a way. I'm going to talk a little bit about Marxism on the one hand and expressivism on the other. These are frameworks that I think fundamentally serve as obstacles to the kind of natural telic orientation we have towards living a life of gratitude. And then I want to identify a third obstacle, that even if you have disabused yourself of the way in which Marxism on the one hand and a Nietzschean-based expressivism on the other should be considered as true, right? So you've disabused yourself of these intellectual errors. I think we're still a very long way from, in fact, being all in the clear when it comes to cultivating gratitude, because achadia, sloth, has a kind of barricading effect on gratitude. And Aquinas, in another passage, question 83, in the second part of the Summa, and I'll read the passage in a little bit, identifies the source of achadia in a false humility that is actually an expression of ingratitude, right? So ingratitude leads to sloth, and sloth, in its classical understanding, is at its heart an impediment to charity, right? And that might sound a little unfamiliar to you, because we often think of sloth in terms of inactivity. But I think in point of fact, achadia is fully compatible with a life of great activity, great work, the life of total work, in fact. Joseph Pieper and Dietrich von Hildebrand both recognize is one in which you can be living ungratefully in terms of the essence of gratitude. So let me say just a few things about what gratitude is as a virtue, drawing upon the inheritance of St. Thomas Aquinas. It's a habitus, it's a disposition, it's a part of justice. It's concerned then, as every element of justice is, with the other, right? It's an other regarding virtue, as Aristotle calls it. It's being a habitus or a disposition or a virtue means that it's not a feeling, right? It's not an action. Virtues are not actions. Virtues enable actions in a consistent manner. It's not an intention. Virtues, habits that are in fact oriented towards our good, virtues involve feelings and actions and intentions and other elements of human psychology besides, but are not to be identified with any one of those elements. So it's an other regarding virtue. In particular, it's a virtue that disposes us to offer thanks to those who deserve our thanks. And that use of the term those, I think, deserves a little attention. We don't offer thanks to things, right? It's always persons to whom we express our gratitude rightfully. You certainly can be grateful for things, but there's a relationship of reciprocity that is proper to the structure of gratitude, reciprocity between persons. And then finally, I'll remind you of what I said about the order of those persons to whom we owe our thanks, right? God for our very existence and a world replete with goodness and value. Those who serve as the causes, the proximate causes of our generation, our parents who've also nurtured us. those who are excelling in dignity, Aquinas says, those who serve as exemplars for our imitation, and then benefactors. All right, if there are any Marxists in the room, you will, and even if you're not a Marxist, this will be true. I'm doing some very quick movement around Marxism, and I'm not. I want to draw upon some passages that John Crosby in Evolutionism and the Ontology of the Human Person, critique of the Marxist theory of the emergence of man, which was published in '76 in the Review of Politics, focuses on, because I think those passages are revelatory of what's at the heart of the metaphysical confusion that goes under the name of Marxism. But I'm not giving a careful interpretation of Marxism here. And I think Marxism is perpetuated in new varieties in our own day and age. So what's at the heart of Marxism is, I think, ultimately a conviction that the world is in need of fundamental changes, and we're the ones who can affect those. Right? There's a turning to the human being as the ultimate source of renewal of a decadent situation, a world in need of reform. Part of the appeal of Marxism in its various forms is the identification of oppressed and oppressors, those who participate in the powerful relationships as the powerful relationships of production, and those who don't share in the means of production. Right. So that's one of the ways in which Marxism can seem to have some relation to Catholic social doctrine. Right. There's a concern for the plight of man, and there's also something right about acknowledging our responsibility, either as individuals or in collective relationships, to make the world a better place, right? But the flaws in Marxism that I want to identify as obstacles to gratitude, and they're flaws that are baked in from the very beginning, are, on the one hand, looking at the material world as basically raw material, right? Something to be shaped to those purposes we identify as right and good, and looking to the human being as not just having a responsibility to affect positive social changes, but being in fact responsible for his own existence. And that might sound like a step too far in terms of what Marx actually says, but what I want to show is that it's not. Okay, and so in this essay by John Crosby, he draws upon one of the early essays of Karl Marx, and I'll just quote: "A being does not regard himself as independent unless he is his own master. And he is only his own master when he owes his existence to himself. A man who lives by the favor of another considers himself a dependent being. But I live completely by another person's favor when I owe to him not only the continuance of my life, but also its creation, when he is its source." Right? But I live completely by another person's favor when I owe to him not only the continuance of my life, but also its creation, when he is its source. My life has necessarily such a cause outside itself if it is not my own creation. The idea of creation is thus one which it is difficult to eliminate from popular consciousness, right? We are, as Etienne Gilson pointed out on many occasions, metaphysical animals. One of the intellectual efforts of Marx was to prevent metaphysical reflection. Right? It doesn't seem to take a whole lot of metaphysical reflection to see that an effect cannot be its own cause, but must be caused by another, and that's part of what John Crosby, one of the arguments in several varieties that he examines in this reflection on Marx. But so we need to not ask certain questions about where we came from. We need to recognize that we are weakened when not only our current existence or the continuation of our existence, but in fact the very source of our existence is due to another. We need to cut that off and acknowledge that we are the source of our own existence. A surprising claim. Here's another quote from that same early set of essays. Since, however, for socialist man, the whole of what is called world history is nothing but the creation of man by human labor, and the emergence of nature for man. He therefore has the evident and irrefutable proof of his self-creation. Right? What serves as the source of our self-creation? Our labor. Our labor. There were close to human but non-human animals, and then those animals began to exercise what we think of as labor, right? Intentional creation of artifacts. Thus, man came to be. And man came to be in ways that may not be ideal for how he wants to live. And man is, as the source of his own creation through his labor, can make, remake, recreate as he wills, right? And so not only ought we to recognize that certain social structures ought to change, but we're the ones who are wholly responsible for affecting those changes. And we can create a world of political structures in which we can flourish because we're, after all, our own makers. Right? To man be the glory. So it's as I said, I think surprising in some ways that Marxism has had such a profound effect on the way in which politically, culturally, we think about things. And again, I'm pulling away from just thinking about Marxism in terms of communism, shared resources. Here's an element of its atheism that I want you to see. And when you think about the fact that many are imbued with this idea that we shape our own destiny, we have the responsibility to do so. We have the means to do so because we are, in a way, our own makers. Not just in a way, in Marx's argument. He claims it as a matter of fact. That has a certain appeal to a sense of power. And you might think yourself quite inured against Marxism of various sorts, but think of the ways in which work can dominate your psychic life, right? Think of the guilt that you feel sometimes on a Sunday when you aren't working, when you've got a carryover from the week that you haven't attended to, or you've got a preparation for the new week that you want to set before you as the day goes on. And that I think is a kind of relationship to labor, and Marx is not the only one responsible for this. Weber and others need to come into a more complete story, but the time that Jews and Christians set aside, not just to do the stuff of offering religion to God, as by justice we're required to do, but really to set aside sacred time in which we are offering thanks to our Creator, right, is deeply threatened by a mode of life in which we justify our own existence by how hard we work, what we produce, what others think about what we produce and what we do. That, to be sure, is an enormous obstacle to gratitude. Second obstacle, in some ways the flip side of the world of constant labor might be thought of as the world of seeking constant pleasures, right? A hedonistic framework. I'm using expressivism to come at this in part because of the way in which in After Virtue, McIntyre identifies emotivism as the philosophical justification for a way of thinking about good and evil that's rooted in your own desires. And then in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, he comes back to emotivism, updates it in terms of expressivism, which he sees as a younger brother of emotivism. And basically, it's a philosophical, I would argue, pseudo-justification that seeks to defend the means by which we construe the essence of human life as a matter of maximizing your preferences, right? So the human being as a consumer might fall under this, man as a in a way a maker of what he prefers and doesn't prefer. But I think you find within this those two elements that I was looking at in Marxism. On the one hand, a world that is not replete with meaning, a world that is not in possession of its own value, a world in a way that's raw material for the pursuit of your own pleasures. And on the other hand, man as a being without an intrinsic purpose other than the purpose we make of our own lives. Through what? Through value creation. And here you see the Nietzschean influence, and ironically the Nietzschean influence, because Nietzsche rails against the hedonist. He rails against the decadent, the last man he despises, right? The late immersion of man within democratic cultures, who spends his days seeking comfort and distractions, a comfortable bed, and a Netflix account, and endless other distractions, right? Because that man has lost a sense of what's really noble. He is as Francis Fukuyama in his earlier book, The End of History and the Last Man, identifies the last man is he who has lost his thumotic dimension, his spirited part. If you remember the tripartite theory of the soul in Plato's account, he's a pathetic man. So if expressivism is the philosophical trappings of contemporary hedonism, then how can Nietzsche be its source? Well, it's Nietzsche's claim. He makes this in a number of his works. Perhaps it's easiest to draw upon the one that's probably most familiar to you in The Genealogy of Morality, when he looks at the contrast between master morality and slave morality, and argues that there's been this transvaluation of all values, right? So in the master morality, masters are self-regarding. They say, we're awesome, we're really good, and there are these pathetic people who are schlecht. They're bad. They're unworthy of identifying with us. They're to be oppressed and exploited. And then the slave morality, which over time rises up, Nietzsche argues, and says, and even persuades the masters that they're not good as oppressors. They're in fact evil, and it's those despondent, pathetic ones who are actually good, right? So the bad in the master morality become the good, and the good in the master morality become the evil, right? This is what he means by the transvaluation of all values. The point here is there is no recourse to the moral law outside of man's creation, whether it's a master saying, this is what it is to be good, me, and those like me, or a slave saying, no, that's evil. We're the ones who are actually good. Blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the earth. Well, in either way, we're the creators of the moral law. And so Nietzsche, on the one hand, rails against a certain kind of nihilism, the annihilation of the man of nobility, but on the other hand, embraces, I argue, a fundamental nihilism about the nature of the moral law and man's relation to it. It's not God's law. There's not a God from whom the law descends. It's not the law that's held within the human heart. It's an act of the will to make the moral law. Okay, I think that this framework provides an inspiration for contemporary hedonism, which I've labeled under expressivism. But these are not new things. The disposition of man in the Garden of Eden, right? He's in the midst of plenty, and he decides to, in fact, Adam and Eve make the choice that they will be the creators of the moral law, right? They're not going to subject themselves to the law of God, but in fact eat the apple tempted by the claim that they could become as gods, as makers of what's good and evil. Okay, that's an ideological structure in one sense, right? It's out there and it's had many permutations throughout history, but it's also woven into the fallen human heart. This desire to take on a godlike status. So those are the two, in a way, external obstacles that I think really do affect us internally in ways that we may not want to admit, right? Do you structure your life in such a way in which you are responsive to the values you find in them? Do you acknowledge that what it is to live well is not to have a life of constant adventures, comforts, variations, good meals, and all the rest that can be so appealing, and are in fact representing certain goods, but to dedicate your life towards the the cultivation of wisdom and the worship of God and the discharging of your responsibilities over those over whom you exercise care, right? So how do you actually order your life? Are you in some manner expressivistic? Sounding a little homiletic here, but what I'm trying to do is to invite you to not just see these external obstacles as the enemy, and we can just point out all of the flaws and strike them to the ground, and then they're done, and now we're ready to live a life of gratitude. I think we all need to wrestle with the ways in which those external ideological obstacles are woven into our internal life in ways that need much more serious and significant incision. Okay, the third obstacle, achadia. The essay that I put into your course packet by Rebecca DeYoung, I think is a really fruitful essay. She's written a few things on achadia, and particularly reflecting on Aquinas' own treatment of it. One of the reasons why I wanted you to look at that essay is because she provides a helpful history of achadia, and already has done some of this work of distinguishing between what we often think of as sloth as mere inactivity, and why it's actually regarded as a capital vice, right? A capital vice in the sense that other vices come from it. You know about the 7 capital vices. The essence of achadia, as I mentioned, Aquinas describes it, is a rejection of charity. So here's from that question 35 in the Summa, second part of the second part. It is a sign of humility if we do not think too much of ourselves through observing our own faults, but if we despise the good we have received from God. This, far from being a proof of humility, shows us to be ungrateful. And from such contempt results sloth, because we sorrow for things we regard as evil and worthless. Right? The greatest good that God offers us is himself. The very essence of charity, as Aquinas describes it, is God's friendship for man, right? God's extension of friendship for us. And question 23 of the second part of the Summa Theologia, when he takes up charity, right? It's the intimate friendship of God for us, by means of which we can now exercise friendship in relation to God and those others whom God loves, right? So it begins with God's love for us and is communicated beyond. What Aquinas identifies is that we can feel a certain disregard for being lovable, right? And both Pieper and Dietrich von Hildebrand draw upon this. We, in the passage I just read from Aquinas, right? We can think of ourselves as in some way not worthy of the goods we have received from God. If we despise the good we have received from God, right? Because we observe our own faults, right? So we're not worthy of those goods, and we despair of the sorrow. We despair of those actions that are a proper response to God's gift of himself to us. Okay? That's that sorrowing, that despairing of the gift, and what the gift requires is the essence of achadia, not the symptoms that we sometimes identify of laziness. And laziness isn't just the laziness of a couch potato, but as I often remind students, the laziness of endless distractions, where you're really active communicating with people either in person or in the virtual land, and don't attend to the works you need to do in pursuit of wisdom, or developing your spiritual life, or what have you. Right, the life of hedonistic activities in the expressivistic mode is fully compatible with achadia. So too is a life of constant labor fully compatible with achadia. Here's Joseph Pieper talking about achadia, and he's echoing here what I'll draw your attention to in Dietrich von Hildebrand. No, this is Pieper. No, the contrary of achadia is not the spirit of work in the sense of the work of every day, of earning one's living. It is man's happy and cheerful affirmation of his own being, his acquiescence in the Word and in God, which is to say, love. Love that certainly brings a particular freshness and readiness to work along with it, but that on which the least experience could conceivably confuse with the tense activity of the fanatical worker. Right? The individual transformed by Christ, responding with love to God's love, certainly is engaged and active, but don't confuse that activity with the fanatical worker, the person who's dedicated to justifying his existence by what he does and how well he does it. So let me expand a little bit on this what I'm calling the Christian remedy to the obstacles. Right, we've got two ideologically framed obstacles, and then we have that deeply interior obstacle of our own failure to really regard ourselves as worthy of God's great gift of himself, and sorrowing over what the response to that gift of God himself would require of us. Right? It's surely a matter of on the one hand, recognizing that we live in a world replete with value, with meaning, with goodness. Right? We have really to wrestle with questions that are inspired by the good, the noble, the beautiful that we encounter all around us. So part of what I think is required is a kind of recognition of the world as made up of beings with their own intrinsic nature and purpose. Of course, that doesn't mean we can't harness their purpose to our own. We are stewards of the world, but it's not a world of raw material. And it's not a world that's a sandbox for our own pursuit of whatever we will as we express our preferences and seek to maximize them. It's a world that's chock full, if you come at this from the perspective of great fantasy writers like C.S. Lewis, maybe I'll call him a great fantasy writer, or J.R.R. Tolkien. Right? It's a world that is full of magic. But the magic is actually in the very nature of things, and the recognition of the nature of things. And then to see ourselves as the magnificent pinnacle of creation. Yes, fallen. Yes, prone to sin. But in fact, imbued with deep meaning, purpose, intrinsic dignity, value, and so valuable that God deigns to, he condescends to befriend us. And that's a fundamental difference between the Christian attitude and even the best of the Greeks. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says, there's something impious about thinking you could ever be friends with God. He's so elevated. He's beyond your desire. You might desire to be a God through a contemplative stance, but God being your friend, that's unholy. And Christ's descent and assumption of human flesh and passion and resurrection, which makes us adopted sons of daughters, that blows apart that what I call the best of the Greek view, and shows just how worthy we are of God's love, and ought to arm us against achadia. But that development of the disposition takes time, right? It's in fits and starts oftentimes, and requires constant vigilance and practice. And that's where I think one of the things that I find so valuable in that essay from Dietrich von Hildebrand on gratitude is it's got tremendous practical advice. It's directing us towards the art of living well, and I want to look at a couple of passages, and then I'll wrap up here. The person who is filled with gratitude toward God, this is von Hildebrand, whose life is permeated by this primary attitude of gratitude, is also the only person who is fully awake. He's the opposite of the apathetic, obtuse person who remains in that state of half-wakefulness, which suffices for the fulfillment of life's practical necessities. He's the opposite of the person who remains on the periphery and takes everything for granted, right? That is to say, gratitude is the remedy of those symptoms of sloth that we identified. And here is another longer passage, and I really encourage you to read this short essay by von Hildebrand if you haven't. One of the more subtle things that he takes up is, if you take what I quoted from 1 Thessalonians before, right? In all things give thanks, for this is the will of God in Jesus Christ for each of you. If you take that to mean that you've got to be rejoicing all the time, you can obscure the reality of suffering and evil, right? There are things about which or toward which you ought not to express gratitude, but insofar as you can connect yourself to, through love, to the suffering of Christ, you can express gratitude in those moments. So read this passage. Then the question arises, what kind of response to crosses and suffering does God require of us? Should our response to them likewise be one of gratitude, because we know that even the crosses and suffering are imposed or permitted by the infinite love of God? It has been frequently asserted that he who truly loves Christ and is transformed in him gives thanks even for suffering and crosses, because they represent a special communion with Christ, the bearing of the cross with him. Indeed, some say there should be no difference in our response of gratitude whether God bestows joy or imposes suffering. Nonetheless, however true and profound may be the view that sees in suffering and grateful resignation and in self-sacrificing love imposed on us by God the gift of being allowed to share the cross of Christ, it cannot be denied that there is a profound difference between gratitude for a great good and submissive, resigned acceptance of a great evil. Those are differences. The Magnificat of the Most Blessed Virgin, my soul rejoices in God my Savior. The Magnificat of the Most Blessed Virgin is obviously a different response than the attitude of the Mother of God standing at the cross. At the cross, her station keeping, stood the mournful mother weeping, close to Jesus to the last. The essence of gratitude includes joy. The resigned acceptance of a cross in itself contains no joy. If it amounts to an heroic joy in the sense of gratitude at being allowed to share the cross of Christ, this does not change the fact that the joy inherent in gratitude is intimately linked to the positive character of a gift. Right? So he's not dispensing with the exhortation to give thanks in all things, but let's not obscure the meaning of suffering and to rejoice at the death of your child or your wife. Obviously, God's not calling us to do that. To have a fundamental disposition of gratitude in which we give thanks in all things, but not necessarily in exactly the same way. There's direct and indirect pathways to this. That's what we're called to do. And there's more on this particular problem that von Hildebrand identifies in that essay on gratitude and much else besides. I encourage you to take a look at it. And finally, I encourage you to reflect on our Blessed Mother as a principal exemplar for whom we ought to give great thanks, and her disposition both towards the joys and the sorrows of life. And I would encourage you to make frequent and regular recourse to her and seeking to cultivate a fundamental disposition of gratitude. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, JJ. So we have about 20 minutes for, or a little bit less time for discussion. Currently, this is the only mic. The rest are behind the curtain. So if you raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic. You have home field advantage.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sanford. I thought that was both informative and clear and beautiful. I'm curious about how, before you got into the obstacles, you were explaining how one of the ways of supporting the thesis that gratitude is fundamental to human flourishing was that gratitude was natural to man. And then one of the ways that you supported that was pointing out how gratitude was natural to children. Mm-hmm. And I would love to hear, more, any additional philosophical support that you have for the idea that gratitude is natural to man. Because I was thinking about this, but I think what's so special that I've noticed about children tends to go in a different direction from gratitude. It tends to be that when they're young, they don't yet have a perception of the other, and so they think that everything is theirs. And that's, I think, what God is talking about when he says to be like a child, because in the kingdom of heaven, everything will be ours. And only later as they grow do they tend to begin to notice the other, and it takes noticing the other to be grateful. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't sure yet if I could jump on board that gratitude was natural to children. I thought it was something they would develop later. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they don't develop, as we all know who watch them. But so could you explain more about how we can see from a philosophical view. I can see it from a theological or from scripture perhaps, but from a philosophical view that gratitude is natural to man.
Yeah, and by natural, I'm not thinking of a kind of innate idea structure, and it just sort of pops out. I mean, and I'm not claiming that an infant is expressing gratitude when nursing her mother, but those ways of caring for the young provide a deep well of reasons for children as they get older to feel grateful. Or if you were to, even in simple things, so I've got children, and trying to remember, my oldest was just here. He had a meeting, he just left, and my youngest is 4. And somewhere around 3 or 4, it seems that all of my kids, I might walk in with a gift. I try not to do that too regularly because I would be buying gifts every day. But just, oh, thank you, and my kids will jump up and give me a hug, say they love me so much, right? And I think, well, I just brought a little ice cream home from Kroger, and it's unworthy of that kind of expression of gratitude. But I think they're drawing upon their, the whole, right? Mom and dad provide so much. There are these special moments that open them up, full embrace. So what I mean is, in a life in which children are cared for, unless they're psychotic, they come to recognize, everything is a gift, and I think in moments, I think of my own childhood, just in bits and flashes, right? There were some moments where I just felt really grateful to be alive. I still have moments like that, and they're a little bit different. Like now that I'm getting old, got out of bed in the morning, still grateful to be alive. But I mean rejoicing from the very essence of your being, and you want to give, you want to say thank you to someone, not something, for being alive, right? So those moments occur in the natural course of life, is what I meant, and if they were nurtured and developed, and we became prudentially reflective about really cultivating those moments, we may develop the virtue of gratitude over time, and that kind of work is impeded by these ideologies, and also our own sense of our unworthiness that results in achadia.
JJ, thank you very much for this discussion of gratitude. I have a couple of very closely connected questions, I think, and part of the reason for the questions rooted in the reference to Marx, which I think is very astute. And part of it is also sort of in my own personal experience. As you know, I did my PhD at the New School for Social Research. Mm-hmm. Lots of Marxists there.
Yes, yeah. It's a holdout. Yeah.
So I feel like I have to represent a little bit of that
yeah.
in my question. But I arrived at the New School in 2008 at the height of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that struck me about the people around me at the New School who I knew to be involved in that movement and were often down by Wall Street during those protests was the fact that in sort of a social activist sort of disposition, or the sets of dispositions that are most closely embodied among social activists, gratitude is very often or almost always missing there. And in fact, this is something that I think you can see at times, not just in social activists of the left, but social activists on the right as well.
There are a lot of angry people these days.
Definitely.
And cancellation works both directions.
Right.
Too.
So on the one hand, I sort of have a question here of, is there perhaps a opposition or a tension between the disposition of gratitude and social activism? So that's sort of the first question. The second question is I think, closely related to this. What I could see a lot of my colleagues at the New School arguing, those who are sort of defenders of the Marxist or left Hegelian sort of approach here, is that the defense of a disposition of gratitude, if there is this tension between gratitude and social activism, could it be argued that gratitude represents something of an ideology of the status quo?
Yeah, an impediment to social change. So
Yeah.
I think you brought out a really interesting tension, and I think you're right to identify gratitude as as being irreconcilable with certain forms of social activism, and so not only do I think many social activists would want to rail against gratitude as a kind of softening or weakening of the fervor with which you need to march and wave a flag and occasionally throw things. They do that. I mean, I think seeing Jewish and Christian and other forms of gratitude often seem to them so much resignation to an oppressive regime, and so I think there is a depth then in what Marx identifies from the very beginning. We've got to cut off the source of gratitude, because it's, in a way, it's resignation, and it's disempowering, and so on. I could go on quite a bit, because this is a really interesting avenue to unravel a little bit. But I would argue that the fundamental disposition of gratitude is fully compatible with a firm commitment to affect the common good through political work and other forms of raising objections to the regime. So here I think von Hildebrand's identification of there are some sufferings, some evils which you might have to resign yourself to, and should not be rejoicing at. In fact, that's a kind of perversion all its own that we can fall into. That actually helps to prudentially reflect upon what do I have to resign myself to, and what do I have a responsibility to change, right? And I have to say that a lot of activism I find on both sides not always, but oftentimes it can obstruct real changes grounded in justice, prudentially pursued, and waste time and effort of those who could really be deployed to effect good. and they can affect those good causes with a grateful spirit that is eyes wide open to what is in fact evil and what is in fact good. So, but thanks for raising that.
I have a question from Shweta, who's joining us all the way from India.
Wow.
She asks, is it necessary for a person to be a theist or transformed by Christ to be grateful? Is there any way to be grateful without being a theist, as we can see that there are a lot of people in the world that do not follow the path of God?
I think that being grateful for your parents, being grateful for your for those who inspire you to live an exemplary life, being grateful for your benefactors, that's certainly possible. And I've known individuals who are not walking the narrow path in one way or another, who can express gratitude oftentimes. I do think that reflecting on gratitude can actually help foster theism. I think when asking the questions that Marx asks us not to ask about the cause of our own existence, going through one or another argument that can recognize the necessity of there being a cause of all that is that can deepen things. So I don't mean to deny that there isn't any possibility of gratitude, and really fostering as much as a non-theist can, a disposition of gratitude. It may lead to theism as you chase down the causal path from proximate to more remote, and come to see the necessity of an ultimate cause. So I don't mean to deny. I guess I could talk about natural versus supernaturally infused gratitude, and the way in which I came at Achadia was certainly rooted in the Christian tradition, which is far broader than just Aquinas' contributions. But there can be a kind of natural Achadia, a kind of sorrowing that. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you for the talk. My question has to do with the virtue of gratitude, and I'm really interested in anytime there's any talk of virtues, identifying what particular affect or desire that it's a perfection of. And so I wanted to maybe push a little further on the association with joy. I don't think of joy as having a particular object. It's kind of a completion or crown of many different activities or desires. Mm-hmm. And we don't always, when we have these discussions, have a clear identification of the desires. So I wanted to give you a chance to see which particular desire would you consider this a perfection of? Mm-hmm. And also I would throw out, Aristotle doesn't clearly identify a faculty of desire with generosity, but it seems very closely related to gratitude, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So virtues are not simply perfections of desires. Aristotle identifies 5 intellectual virtues, and none of them is a desire. They're ways of thinking, ways of encountering the world that are brought to a perfection. The moral virtues work with desire, but I wouldn't want to argue that they're simply perfections of a desire. I think and Aristotle doesn't have a notion of will, right? In the sense of what the Christian tradition inherits from Augustine with voluntas. So when Aquinas talks about gratitude as a part of justice, right? Justice, Aquinas argues, is a perfection of the will, temperance is a perfection of the concupiscible appetite, and courage is a perfection of the irascible appetite. But the will is rational desire, and the desire to do right by others, right? To give them their due. And so I would argue that gratitude is a part of our will to render to others what we owe them. And then finally on Aristotle, at the outset of the second of his two books on friendship, he identifies eternal debts. He says that we find it to be impossible to pay off certain debts that we've incurred to our parents, but even more so to our teachers. And one can imagine Aristotle in walking along the Peripatos, perhaps saying this. So he does include expressions of thanks as part of justice, and you see it particularly within distributive justice. He doesn't give the kind of concerted focus to it that Aquinas does. Thanks for your question.
Well, thank you very much, JJ. We're at the end of our time.